Chapter 9. Caldaria was a riot of colour. Fire jugglers and circus acrobats cartwheeled and danced their way through the streets. Even the mages got in on the celebrations. Fireworks lit up the sky and magic dazzled and amazed the stunned onlookers. All thoughts of war and evil were cast out of the folks' mind as they celebrated the Feast of the Brave Knight. Luxon had pulled his cloak tighter about his shoulders. Despite it being the height of summer, an unnatural chill was in the wind. He stood on the balcony outside the dorms, leaning against the rough stonework. Despite the festivities, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been tormenting him for the past few moons. Word had come from Sungard of the overthrow of the Privy Council. According to all accounts, the Midlands were now under the command of what folk named, in whispers, the Legion of the Usurper. Rayson hadn't wasted any time in establishing his authority over his new kingdom. The sot had even tried to have himself crowned in the ruins of the old King's Hall, on the summit of the peak which rose over the capital. Resistance had been virtually non-existent. The legionaries that had supported the council quickly bowed the knee to their general. In the days that followed, Luxon had spent long hours under the tutelage of Thanos. He had learned so much already. A firework exploded high in the sky in a breathtaking riot of colours, causing Luxon's companion to shout out in joy. Despite all that was happening in the world, and to him, he couldn't help smile at the sight of Yeppert clapping his hands in glee. "Oh, that was incredible!" the chubby boy laughed. More fireworks shot into the sky, one exploding into the image of a knight, whilst another took the form of the monster Necron. Upon seeing the beast, Luxon heard the booing of the crowd. "Why are they booing, Lux?" Yeppert asked, confusion evident in his voice. Luxon rolled his eyes. "Come on, Yeppert. You must have heard the story of Necron and Astran. We celebrate it every year." Yeppert had a look of confusion on his face, as though he was deep in concentration. After a while, his eyes went wide. "Oh yeah, you tell the tale so well, Lux. Go on, tell it again." Luxon sighed. He knew he was a good storyteller. The two boys had spent many a night telling each other tales from their respective homelands. The tales from Plock, where Yeppert was from, made for some pretty interesting, if far-fetched stories. His favourite involved a witch, a mage, and a rather amorous chicken. "All right, so here goes," Luxon said, walking back inside the dorm room. He took a cushion from his bed and threw it on the ground before sitting carefully upon it. Yeppert also settled himself on the floor in eager anticipation of the tale. Whenever Luxon told a tale, he liked to be as dramatic as possible, so he pulled his hood over his head, hiding his face in shadow. "Long ago, before the days of the king of Delfinnia and even before the Golden Empire, the descendants of the first man, Neveran, prospered for thousands of years. But always working in the shadows was the spirit of Neveran's evil brother, Danon. The offspring of the Dark One and his wicked wife had not been idle after this first defeat in the days of the gods, and whilst the world above them witnessed the rise and fall of kings and empires, they focused on furthering their power in the magic dark arts of witchcraft and the blackest of magic. In the age of three empires, a powerful wizard known as Necron, who was also secretly a disciple of Danon, bound his soul with magic so foul that the sight of his wicked experiments remains tainted to this day, and the first lich was created." Yeppert shivered at the thought of such a terrifying monster. He had seen pictures and read about them in the ancient texts found in the Great Library. Necron rose to dominate all other followers of the Engist cult, and his foul influence spread to the world of men. With promises of power and riches, he seduced the rulers of the Sarpi Empire. Within less than a century, that noble and rich empire had fallen into decadence and corruption, its once good and fair people fallen into wickedness. Soon the Lich's influence had spread to the Yola and Tulin empires, until only the fractured and broken Nivion empire remained. Once more, conflict erupted on Hesperia. Millions perished in the bloodletting as the Nivion empire desperately tried to halt Necron's power. Yeppert's eyes had grown wide. "What happened? Not everyone had gone bad, surely?" he cried. Luxon smiled. "Not everyone went evil, of course. As is the way in most of the old tales, there's always a counter to the bad. After all, isn't it always preached by the church that the light always balances out the dark?" Luxon cleared his throat, and once more pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. There was definitely something on the air. The summers in Caldaria were rarely so cold. He continued telling the tale. At the Battle of the Greenmoor, the armies of the three empires clashed and their fleets fought at sea. The already weakened Niverans fought bravely, but the power of Necron could not be broken. When all hope seemed lost, a knight of the Nivian Empire called Astran rode forth on his white stallion and bellowed a challenge to the Lich, vowing never to surrender. By the way, pausing the story to Yepard's obvious dismay, I once visited the place where the battle took place. Yepard scoffed. You've been to the Blackmoor? As if. You'd have to be mad to go there. They say that banshees and the ghosts of the dead roam those evil moors. Luxon chuckled. I went there with my mother when I was younger. If it was evil as everyone says, then why is the city of Blackmoor there? A look of concentration crossed Yepard's features as he tried to argue. With an exasperated sigh, he admitted defeat. There are banshees, he grumbled. Anyway, Luxon interrupted, back to the story. A large firework lit up the boy's room, followed a few seconds later by the loud explosion of the black powder. The cheers of the crowd followed on the breeze. The scars of that mighty battle are evident in Delfinnia today, as the once prosperous region of Greenmoor was turned into a wasteland. Today it is known, he paused for effect, as the Blackmoor. Anyway, Astran rode forth from the lines of his battered army and drew his sword, Asphodel. Yepard cooed at the name. The Sword of Light, he cried excitedly. Everyone in Delfinnia had heard of the legendary blade, the sword that had been wielded by heroes throughout the ages. Most of the tales of the mythical weapon were probably just fairy tales. After all, any story that had the sacred blade in it always went down well with the common folk. Luxon smirked at his friend's expression. With the sword, thought to be that mighty blade Asphodel, the two battled for hours until finally Astran mortally wounded Necron in single combat. Sadly for our hero, he too was killed by the Lich's forces. And to this day, people of Delfinnia celebrate Astran with the Feast of the Brave Knight on Midsummer's Eve. The end, Luxon said, spreading his arms wide. Yepard sat in silence, confusion evident on his face. He blinked. Wait, that's it? Yep, Luxon replied simply. But Astran died. What happened next? Luxon sighed and stood up from the floor. Even sat on the cushion, his bum was growing numb from the hard stone surface. He pulled his hood down and ran a hand through his hair before answering his confused friend. Astran died, and the forces of Necron obliterated the warriors of Nivion, hailing in the 1,000-year-long Age of Darkness. Not a very happy ending, I know, but that's why most storytellers stop at that point, when Astran cut down Necron. Yepard sat on the floor, looking from one hand to the other. He was a bright lad, just not when it came to history or the meaning of things. If Astran died, and the goodies lost, then why on earth do we celebrate the Feast of the Brave Knight? Just as Luxon was about to answer, a deep voice interrupted him, causing Yepard to jump in fright. Because the tale of Astran shows that it is noble to stand against evil at all costs, and never to fear death. If people follow this example of courage and bravery, then evil can always be defeated. Stood in the doorway to the boy's room was the man Luxon had met when he came to after his failed levitation experiment. The Nightblade, Wellesley, gave a bow. Yepard jumped to his feet, his mouth hanging open in surprise and awe. He'd never met a Nightblade before. Forgive me for my intrusion, Luxon, but Master Thanos wishes for you to come to his chamber at the Ark Tower. He sent me to escort you there. Some riders from the south arrived earlier this evening and your name cropped up, the Nightblade explained. Luxon had quickly pulled on his shoes and followed Wellesley out of the room, throwing a bemused look at his friend as he went. Curiosity filled him as he wondered at the identities of the riders that had named him. As far as he knew, no one outside of Calderia knew him except for his mother. Together he and Wellesley walked out of the dorm and into the bustling streets. The bangs and pops of the fireworks and the host of entertainers couldn't shake the feeling of unease that reached into Luxon's chest. Chapter 10. Caden paced the opulent room, a frown adorning his features. His blue eyes were shut tightly in prayer as he walked, and the mutterings of his appeals to his god broke the silence. Elira sat on one of the high-backed leather chairs, her feet resting on the edge of a large crystal desk that dominated the room. She struggled to keep her eyes open. All knowledge of time was lost to her as she battled against her weariness. The two had travelled for 3 days up the King's Highway, and the stress of the trip had finally caught up with her. The journey would normally have taken a day at most, but with marauding bandits and battered armies using the same road it had taken a lot longer. At one point, they had been forced to abandon the road entirely as they encountered a battalion of the Baron of Balnor's men being butchered by a mob of bandits. She shuddered at the memory. There'd been so much blood. "You're going to wear the nice mage's carpet out if you don't stop your pacing, Caden," she sighed wearily. The knight stopped dead. His formerly pristine mantle was covered with mud, as were his boots, and the rest of him looked no better. Elira, too, was covered in dirt and grime. Her travelling cloak was torn, and her trousers had tears in the knees. Their night hiding in the wild woods from a hunting band of sinister-looking shades had taken its toll. More than once, they had encountered things that should not have been there. The wails of a banshee and other fell beasts had haunted the nights, highlighting just how low and dangerous the once peaceful kingdom had become. "I'm sorry," Caden replied, tiredness evident in his voice. "I don't feel comfortable being in this city. It's the home of folk my brother knights and I are often tasked with hunting down. I don't trust them." Elira stood and placed a hand gently on his arm. "I understand," she said kindly. "You're feeling what I felt like when I was at the Priory," she said comfortingly. If she was honest with herself, she would have admitted that even being in a city of her kind made her just as nervous as being with the knights. She had never met another mage before, let alone a Grand Master. Caden sighed, turning to face his young charge. The days on the road had given him a newfound respect for the young woman before him. Gone was the scared, frightened girl he had met months previously in that cold, damp dungeon in Retbit. The time they had spent together in the Priory was some of the best times he could ever remember. She had practiced with a sword every day until the Night Masters had deemed her capable enough to risk the roads. "I'm sorry, Elira. I forget that this place is just as strange to you as it is to me. No doubt you'll wish to learn all you can about your heritage." He placed his hand upon hers. Her skin was soft and warm. They looked into each other's eyes, a silence passing between them. A knock on the oak door broke the tension, causing them both to blush. Into the room stepped a tall man in the robes of a master mage. A pleasant smile was on his face as he offered his hand to Caden. The knight hesitated before he shook it. "Greetings. I am Thanos, Grand Master of the Upper Ring and the Magister of the Mage Realm of Calderia. I welcome you, Sir Knight, and offer you and your companions shelter in these troubled times. What is ours is yours." Elira almost gasped when the mage gripped her hand softly. She felt a jolt like that of being stung by a wasp shoot up her arm as his skin made contact with hers. For a brief moment, his piercing blue eyes widened in surprise. He composed himself quickly. Elira stood stunned, the tingling sensation spreading up her arm. "Forgive me for the delay in meeting with you. As you can hear, the celebrations are rather exuberant," Thanos explained with a smile. The distant sound of fireworks and drunken songs could be heard outside the chamber's solitary window. "You told my steward that you were here to look for someone called Luxon," the Grand Master queried, as he sat in the chair on the opposite side of the crystal desk. "I have taken the liberty to send someone to fetch the only person in the city going by that name." When seated, he poured himself a cup of wine from a clay jug. Elira blinked. She didn't recall seeing a jug on the desk's surface when they had arrived. Caden sat in one of the chairs and accepted the cup offered to him. "Yes," he said. "This may sound strange, but we were sent here by the Order to try and find this Luxon person. We believe he can help us find someone." Caden shifted uncomfortably under the mage's gaze. "And how did you learn of this person?" Thanos asked, his eyes flickering to Elira. Caden stammered, unsure of what to say. Elira stepped forward. "I heard his name in a vision," she said, her tone hinting at a challenge. She knew she wasn't crazy. She knew that the mysterious man before her would understand. Surely the Grand Master of the magic wielders in Delfinnia had similar visions of his own. Thanos sat back in his chair, his eyebrows arching in surprise, before sitting forward and knotting his fingers together. "A vision, you say?" "Yes, a vision. One that has been haunting me more and more over recent days," Elira explained. "Truth be told, they are the main reason we are here, to try and discover their meaning," Caden added. Thanos looked at the girl with renewed interest. The spark he had felt when he had touched her hand, the strange way in which the magic appeared to be distorted around her aura, and now the revelation that she had visions. An amused smile briefly touched his lips as he wondered whether the noble knight knew what exactly it was he had been travelling with all this time. The door to the chamber opened. Standing in the doorway was Luxon. At his back was the tall Nightblade, Wellesley. The younger lad looked sheepish and nervous. His bright eyes darted around the chamber until they focused on the knight and the strange girl. Thanos leaned forward in his seat, slightly curious as to whether his young apprentice would notice something out of place. To his surprise, Luxon's eyes stayed fixed on the girl a tad too long. The boy blushed slightly. Thanos had to restrain a chuckle. He had noticed something all right. He had noticed her good looks. Boys will be boys. "Ah, Wellesley, Luxon, welcome. Come in and take a seat," Thanos greeted warmly. "What's this about, Master?" Luxon asked, recognizing the mantle worn by the knight. A knot of fear twisted in his gut. All of the apprentices and students knew the stories of the merciless knights who hunted down their kind. Wellesley remained standing. He too had noticed the knight. His hand drifted lazily to the hilt of his sword. Feeling the tension rise in the room, Thanos stood and smacked a palm on the crystal table's surface. "Listen here," he said. "These two are our guests. Sir Caden serves the Order of Niveron, but he is not here to harm anyone. His companion is Lyra, a girl who's been having visions of late. Visions in which you have been mentioned, Luxon." The boy took a step back in surprise. After a few minutes of awkward introductions and explanations, Luxon found himself alone with Lyra in the Grand Master's chambers. The two sat in silence. He twiddled his fingers. She checked her fingernails for dirt. As to where Thanos, the knight, and the Nightblade had gone, he didn't know, but he had got the sense that his master had intended for him to be alone with the girl. She was pretty, he couldn't deny that, but she wasn't a patch on Hannah. "You're younger than I thought," Lyra said, causing him to jump in surprise. "I thought that you would be some mighty powerful mage, with white hair and a long beard, and the ability to shoot fireballs from my arse, no doubt," Luxon interjected. Lyra glared at him. Luxon sighed in annoyance. "Listen," he said. "I don't know what you and Sir What's-His-Face want with me, but I reckon I'm not the guy you're looking for. I'm just a lowly apprentice mage who's never even travelled south of the Ridder River. I have dreams too. That's all your visions are," he explained, trying to sound authoritative. "Just dreams." Lyra stared daggers at the boy. "You just said you're nothing but a lowly apprentice. So what do you know about things?" Her voice rose in pitch as frustration and fear edged into her words. "I haven't been able to sleep in months. I keep hearing names, seeing things I never want to see, and always I see the face with the black eyes." Luxon stared at her in disbelief. "You hear names?" he asked quietly. Lyra nodded, her golden hair falling into her eyes in the process. She swept it back over her ear. "Every night I'm told two names." She stared at one of the tapestries on the room's wall. A blue and golden pentacle was emblazoned on a blood-red background. It was the sigil of the first ring of magic. "Names that I do not know. Adelaide is one, and the other—" She paused and stared at him. Her eyes filled with something akin to yearning, a yearning for answers. "The other name is Luxon. Always Luxon." Luxon looked away from her gaze. He didn't know what was happening. First had come his own dreams. He had always dreamt, but now the dreams were growing more vivid, more strange and terrifying. Then he had been told of his unique gift of being a thaumaturgist, a magic wielder able to cast spells just through thought and feelings. And now he was being told that he was appearing in the dreams of this strange girl from half a world away. The fireworks and the festivities were the perfect cover. Moving quickly through the unsuspecting crowds of drunken revellers, the group of men went unchallenged. Their crimson cloaks didn't stand out on this most festive of evenings. Getting over the city's crystal walls, however, had proven problematic. But to the Crimson Blades, nothing was impossible. After walking through alleys and down back streets, the assassins reached their destination. The Arc Tower stood strong and tall above the city like a giant. It was the tallest structure in Delfinnia, now that the Sun Spire in Sungard was now just a ruin. A once magnificent structure toppled during the Night of Tears, along with countless other irreplaceable buildings and monuments. Inside the Arc Tower was the assassin's target. Chapter 11. The sound of leather-soled boots stealthily creeping along the stone-flagged floor was almost indistinguishable over the background noise of the celebrations, which seemed like they would never end. Only a man who was trained to notice such detail would be able to pick it out, and Caden was such a man. He thought they would be safe in the city, but it seemed that danger had once again caught up with him. He deftly slid from his bed onto the balls of his feet. moving as quickly and as silently as he could to the corner of the small room where he had billeted for the night. After their long journey, Caden had jumped at the Archmage's offer of a room and clean sheets for the night. He had talked at length with the man, but it felt as though their conversation was but a sideshow after he had left Elira with the boy Luxon. They had spoken of the events in the world, of the war and of the dark murmurs emanating from the outer reaches of the realm. The creeping noise was drawing closer to the room. He was certain. He drew his long sword from its sheath, the familiar weight giving him some comfort as he prepared to defend himself. He'd kick himself if it proved to be nothing, but being in the city of the mages, he wasn't prepared to take any chances. The room in which he found himself was comprised of a small chest, bed, a worn-out leather-backed chair and a tiny window high on the wall. There was no visible way of escape, aside from the door to which the footsteps now approached. There was no access to the outside. Caden set his jaw. He would have to make a stand, or at least hold them off until he could think of some way out of this. He was one of the best swordsmen in the Order, but he had no idea if the people sneaking up to his door knew who and what he was. But he wasn't about to let them find out. His thoughts flashed to Elira, still in the Archmage's room with the boy. He almost swore to himself. Were the mages betraying him because he was a knight of Niveron? It was certainly possible. After centuries of his order hunting rogue mages and magic wielders, why would they not want to seek vengeance? With no king and no king's laws, there was nothing stopping them from murdering him. The land was in chaos, and the other knights would never learn of his fate. As his mind ran wild, the sound of the stealthy footsteps had now stopped directly outside of his door. He knew now for certain that his suspicions had been right. If they were mages, he wouldn't make it easy for them. He positioned himself to one side of the doorframe and waited for his adversary. The door handle turned slowly, and with a quiet click, the door silently began to open. Caden tensed, ready to make his move. 2 throwing knives flew through the open door, digging themselves deep into the bed right where his head would have been. The assassin noticed that his quarry was not where he was supposed to be, and moved into the room, a sharp and lethal curved blade in his hand. Caden wasted no time and immediately hacked his sword in a downward stroke, slicing his attacker's arm clean off at the elbow. The knight bellowed a challenge and struck again, this time burying his blade up to the hilt into the assassin's chest. The lifeless corpse slid off the blood-soaked blade and slumped onto the floor. Caden ducked, just as another thrown knife stuck in the wall where he had just been standing. He immediately threw himself to the floor and rolled to his feet as more of the 2 robed figures charged him with familiar curved daggers in their hands. He was now in the main upstairs corridor of the tower's dorm area. It was narrow, with various doors leading to the other guest rooms on either side. His attackers blocked the staircase that would lead him to the main hall and perhaps to safety. He could see only one other possible escape route, the large window at the far end of the passage. He parried a quick strike from the lead attacker, bringing his elbow up and striking the assassin square in the throat. The robed figure immediately fell to the floor, clutching his throat, gasping for air now that his windpipe had been crushed. The second assassin was more patient, holding back and watching Caden for any sign of weakness. The knight didn't give him the chance, and instead charged. As he made a lunge for the assassin's head, the robed figure moved with astounding speed, slashing him in the face. The pain was extraordinary, and a burning sensation began to emanate from the wound. Caden had no time to think, as again the assassin was on him, curved dagger swinging and stabbing savagely. It took all of his concentration to parry the blows that were raining down on him. The pain in his face had begun to subside, but now numbness was spreading out from it. One side of his face had now lost most of its feeling. It was a poisoned blade, he realized with horror. Just what poison it could be, he didn't know, but it would surely kill him if he couldn't escape and find a healer soon. He now knew the assassin's intent. They would keep him occupied long enough for the poison to take effect, and then they would watch him die a slow death, or perhaps capture him alive. The realization struck him like a fist. The poison wasn't intended to kill him, but to paralyze him. He could feel the numbness spreading through his body now. He had to escape, and soon. Questions flashed into his mind. Were they trying to capture him and Elira? Had they been followed on the King's Road? Or were they here for some other nefarious purpose? Caden feigned high with his sword and rotated his wrists so that now his blade was ready for an upward slash to the assassin's face. The assassin, however, moved to parry the cut, and as he did so, Caden twisted again, causing his sword to catch the assassin in the throat. Scarlet blood hit the corridor wall as the sword sliced clean through the attacker's throat, the robed figure crumpling to the floor in a heap as blood continued to spurt from the wound. Caden leaned against the passageway wall, his breath now wheezing out of him. His whole face felt numb, and the sensation was spreading through his arms. He made to head for the staircase, but the familiar figure of yet another assassin was cresting the top step. His dagger was drawn, looking for vengeance for his comrade's death. Where was the tower security? Where were the mages? The large window was his only possible escape route. He was in no condition to take on another of these vicious killers. Steeling himself, he ran as fast as he could at the window. With an ear-piercing smash, he went flying through the air, hoping that there would be something soft to cushion his fall. The fall felt like forever, and with a bone-jarring thud, Caden hit the ground, fortunately landing on a hay basket that took most of the impact. His shoulder was dislocated, but apart from that, he was all right. Dragging himself to his feet, he staggered away from the tower. He made it only a few paces before falling into unconsciousness. The last thing he heard was the city's alarm bells beginning to toll out in the night air. He had escaped. Chapter 12. The door to Thanos' study burst open with an ear-splitting cracking of wooden timbers. The alarm bells were tolling loudly outside the Arc Tower, and the sound of frightened screams from the partygoers on the streets clawed at Luxon's nerves. Whatever was happening outside the tower sounded like the entire void had been set free. Luxon and Lyra were hiding behind Thanos' desk. The sturdy, crystalline surface was far stronger than it appeared, and its opaque surface offered them some semblance of cover. The girl was breathing hard. If she was reacting like Luxon was, then her heart was pounding a mile a minute. Cautiously, Luxon poked his head above the lip of the desk, his eyes widening as he saw a robed figure standing in the doorway. The material of the robe was the colour of fresh blood. The hood hid the person's features, but it was clear as to their intention. In their hand was a vicious dagger, and slung across their back was a lethal-looking crossbow. Luxon ducked back down, holding a finger to his lips to tell Lyra to keep quiet. He could have kicked himself. He hadn't been trained in combat magic. All he knew was basic tricks and the levitation spell. The mages of the lowest ring, like he was, were only taught the most basic of spells. Things like illumination and basic healing. He'd give anything to be a higher mage, with knowledge of the elemental combat magic such as lightning or flame. The robed figure stalked into the room, the creak of leather boots the only sound coming from the assassin. Lyra's eyes widened in fear as she heard the killer creep closer to the desk. Luxon gestured for her to stay still. He closed his eyes and focused. He could feel a tingling sensation spread up his arm as power flowed into his body. He had to refrain from laughing as he felt the magic build within. The tingling became more intense as he focused on the heavy desk. He raised a hand slowly. Lyra stifled a gasp as the desk began to rock, the noise instantly drawing the attention of the assassin. The footsteps grew closer. Luxon had his eyes shut tightly as he concentrated. Lyra screamed as the assassin leapt on top of the desk, his dagger pointing menacingly at her. She scrambled back away from the killer. "Luxon! Help me!" she cried. Luxon smiled. "Of course." He flung his arms upwards. Lyra screamed again as the desk shot into the air, the surprised assassin on top. With a smash, the desk, complete with the stunned assassin, slammed into the crystalline ceiling, a sickening squelch the only clue as to the assassin's fate. Luxon leapt backwards as the debris of the desk and the gory remains of the assassin crashed back to the ground. A red smear was clearly visible on the ceiling. A wave of tiredness threatened to overwhelm him, but Lyra caught him before he collapsed in exhaustion. He placed a hand on her shoulder to steady himself and shook his head to clear the dizziness that threatened to overtake him. "Thanks. I forgot how tiring that spell was," he muttered. A loud crash came from the hallway outside the chamber. The sound of alarm bells from the city had now been replaced by screams and the sounds of clashing steel. The city was under assault. A ball of fire zipped past the doorway, accompanied by an agonized scream. A crimson-robed assassin appeared in the doorframe, his robes aflame as he writhed on the stone floor. Lyra recoiled at the sight and the smell of a man being burnt alive by magic fire. The Nightblade Wellesley stepped over the charred corpse, relief evident on his face when he saw Luxon and the girl. "Praise be that you two are safe," he said. "Wellesley, what's happening?" Luxon asked. The sounds of battle were growing fiercer and louder. "Calderia is under attack. Assassins somehow managed to infiltrate the city and open the gates for an army that was hiding in the woods to the southeast," Wellesley explained, fatigue evident in his voice. "What Nightblades there are in the city will be attempting to retake the gatehouse, but as for Master Thanos and the other mages, I've no clue." Wellesley's black leather armour had been ripped by a knife blade. "Are you hurt?" Lyra asked, as she noticed the damage. A rivulet of blood was oozing from the tear. Wellesley shook his head in the negative. "No, I'll be fine. The bastard only dinged me. He took me by surprise, is all." Tentatively, he touched the wound, only for his black gloves to come away sticky with blood. Cautiously, he leaned out into the hallway before gesturing for Luxon and Elira to follow. "Stick with me and stay close. These Crimson Blades may look like ordinary men, but they move like something unnatural. We need to reach the top of the Arc Tower. That's where Thanos and the other Masters are likely to be." They passed a number of chambers. In several, the unlucky occupants lay dead. In one, a mage had taken out several assassins, their charred remains releasing a foul smoke into the hall. In another, a female mage was knelt over a wounded guardsman. The light emanating from her palms was her attempt at healing the knife wound in the man's chest. The three continued slowly through the tower's lower floor. Despite the carnage all around them, they had not encountered any more assassins. Finally, they reached the great staircase which led to the levitation platform that would take them to the tower's highest levels. Wellesley crept forward, taking cover behind one of the crystal pillars that dominated the base of the stairs. Each step was made of brightly coloured glass, which gave the stairs their nickname, the Rainbow Staircase. Luxon and Elira both took cover behind another pillar. Standing at the top of the stairs was a young man clad in steel plate armour, a red bird emblazoned on his mantle. "Eclin," Luxon whispered savagely as he recognized him. The youngest son of the Baron of Retbit was barking angry orders to half a dozen of his soldiers. "Might explain how they knew how to get inside the walls," Wellesley muttered. The Nightblade drew the hilt of his tourmaline blade. These special swords were only used by Nightblades, as they were the only ones skilled enough to wield them. Comprised of magical energy, the blade was pure magic, harnessed through the Nightblade's own reserves. "He's just an arrogant, stupid boy," Wellesley said angrily. "Who knows how much blood has been spilt on his account this night?" Luxon knew what the Nightblade was intending, as he saw the man's shoulders tense. He desperately wanted to stop him, but Wellesley shrugged off his hand as he tried to hold him back. Luxon grabbed Elira's hand and pulled her further behind the pillar they were hiding behind. The girl resisted at first, but relented as she saw the look in his eyes. "Eclin!" Wellesley shouted as he stepped out into the open. He pointed his sword threateningly towards the boy.
"Well, well, well. If it isn't the high and mighty Wellesley,"
Eclin sneered. The group of soldiers gathered behind their leader, swords and spears at the ready. Each wore a tunic with the red bird of Retbit upon the jupon and a suit of chainmail underneath. "I can take your goons, Eclin," Wellesley said confidently as he stepped closer to the base of the stairs. "Why are you here? What do you want?" Eclin laughed.
"I want payback for the shame bestowed upon me,"
he shouted, a tinge of madness evident in his rage-ravaged voice.
"I want Luxon and his fat friend hanging from hooks. And, oh yes, I want the power of the mages to give to my father so he can end the war and claim the Sundered Crown and become king."
Eclin pointed at Wellesley.
"Kill him!"
he screamed. The Retbit soldiers charged down the staircase. It was 6 against 1, but Wellesley did not turn to flee. Instead, he readied his blade and waited. As the first soldier got within striking distance, the Nightblade raised his left hand and unleashed a bolt of lightning from his fingertips. The blast spluttered out of existence. Wellesley's eyes went wide in surprise. The soldier smiled wickedly. "Okay, so no magic," the Nightblade muttered. With a flick of his wrist, the sword struck like a flash to strike the chuckling guard in the throat. With a gurgled cry, the soldier collapsed to the ground, his hands feebly trying to close the wound which pumped crimson blood onto the shiny floor. The other troops hesitated. A fatal mistake. Like a blur, Wellesley fell upon them. His bright yellow tourmaline blade flicked and slashed in all directions as he carved his way through limbs and armour. He parried a spear thrust and lashed out with a blast of flame which blinded his attacker, allowing him to bury his sword deep into his chest. Within moments, all 6 of the Retbit soldiers lay dead at the Nightblade's feet. Not a single sword or spear had even come close to wounding him.
"Well done!"
Eclin laughed sarcastically, his slow claps echoing up the staircase.
"How about you take on someone a bit more akin to your own skills?"
Wellesley raised his arms as if to challenge the arrogant boy. "Comparing yourself to a Nightblade just shows how stupid you are, little man. Come and pay for what you've done here," Wellesley challenged. Eclin simply smirked. He clicked his fingers. Luxon held his breath in anticipation. The sight of the Nightblade in combat had been incredible. Wellesley confirmed all the tales about their legendary feats. He narrowed his eyes at Eclin. The boy had always been a bully, but never had he been so cocky, so sure of himself. Not even the sight of his men being slain had fazed him. Something was terribly wrong. He could feel it. Just as he was about to shout a warning to Wellesley, a crimson-robed assassin leapt from the shadows. The Nightblade swung about to face his attacker, but was too slow to counter the impossibly fast dagger thrust. The vicious blade sunk deeply into his abdomen, causing him to cry out in surprise and pain. The assassin pirouetted upon his left heel, delivering a vicious roundhouse kick and sending the Nightblade crashing into a heap at the base of the stairs. Visibly stunned, Wellesley staggered back onto his feet, but before he was able to raise his weapon or use magic, the assassin was on him and raining savage blows. He was being beaten to death, and all the while, Acadus chuckled. "I must be leaving now, Wellesley. Send my regards to the other dead mages you'll soon meet in the afterlife." Luxon darted out from his hiding place, Elira hot on his heels. The assassin was focused on the Nightblade, who was desperately trying to defend himself. Blood poured from the knife wound, but still he fought. Acadus, meanwhile, had stepped onto the levitation pads and was now flying upwards to the tower's upper floors. Luxon watched helplessly as the assassin parried a sword thrust and grabbed Wellesley's arms. The Nightblade tried to break free, but to no avail. The assassin twisted. A sickening popping noise reverberated around the hall, quickly followed by the Nightblade's agonized screams. Wellesley collapsed on the floor, unconscious from the pain, his arms flopping uselessly to his sides. Anger surged through Luxon. He raised his hands at the assassin, who now spun to focus on the boy and the girl. With a roar, Luxon unleashed his fury. Heat flowed through him until fire erupted from his palms, engulfing the assassin and setting fire to the tapestries hanging above the stairway. Within moments, the killer's robes were aflame, his skin blistering and vaporizing, his blood boiling. It happened so fast that he didn't even have time to scream. The stench of cooked meat almost made Elira vomit, but her attention turned to the unconscious Nightblade. "Do what you can for him," Luxon panted, his breath shuddering out of him. His hair and clothes were steaming. Elira winced, as she remembered that time on the road when she had used such magic. "There's a medica back down the hallway and through the library," Luxon told her. "Ask for Hannah. She will know what to do." Before Elira could ask him what he was going to do, Luxon bolted up the stairs and towards the levitation platforms. Acadus would pay for this. Luxon stepped onto the levitation pad and braced himself. Within seconds, a white light emanated from the floor and propelled him skyward. The feeling of weightlessness was disorienting, but he shrugged it off. Instead, he focused on what he might find at the top of the tower. Acadus was too cocky. Luxon didn't understand how his old foe from Ratbit had managed to infiltrate the city of the mages. It should have been impossible. He glanced upwards. A sense of panic coursed through him as the ceiling rapidly approached. He always hated the levitation pads. At the back of his mind was always the possibility that they could malfunction and leave him as just a red stain on the crystal ceiling's surface. To his relief, his ascent slowed until he stopped completely and was left floating in mid-air. He stepped forward onto the solid platform which led to the Arch-Chamber, the council room of the mages of Delfinnia. Being just a lowly apprentice, he'd never been allowed this high in the tower. Ahead of him was the imposing bluish crystalline door. Angry voices were coming from the other side. Luxon dashed towards it, slowing as he got within earshot of those in the chamber. "The other claimants will not stand for this, you do realize. Assaulting the mages cannot be ignored. They will not accept you coercing us into using our power for your gain." The calm tones of Thanos drifted through the crack in the doorway. Luxon edged closer until he could peek inside the chamber. Standing in a semicircle were Acadus, a number of Ratbit knights, and a short, dumpy man with an angry face. The short man wore ornately decorated armour painted with the red birds of Ratbit. In his right hand was a long sword, which he pointed menacingly at the other occupants in the room. Opposing them stood the masters of Calderia. Thanos, tall and statesmanlike, stood in the middle. At his right-hand side was Master Rygus, and on the other, Master Dufran. The other masters stood behind those three, their expressions a mixture of anger and confusion. "Why don't they just strike Acadus and his men down?" Luxon thought. By all rights, the mages should have had no trouble driving off the attackers who had no magic of their own to speak of. Aside from Acadus and the supernatural assassins, the soldiers seemed to possess no arcane ability. "Your powers aren't that impressive," the small man tittered.
I have rendered you powerless just by using these."
Luxon squinted to see what the man held. In a gauntleted fist dangled what looked like a necklace. Upon seeing it, Thanos took an involuntary step backwards. Shock was evident on the other masters' faces as well. "The talisman of Nagist," the Grand Master whispered in surprise. "Baron, where did you obtain these?" The Baron of Retbit laughed, and his goons followed suit. Acadas simply smirked.
"A witch told me the secret. I believe they make your spells ineffective. Or was it that they drain your kind's powers? I forget the details," the Baron mocked. "Anyway," he continued, "I'm here to exact vengeance for you dishonouring my son's good name, and of course to enlist your aid in the war. With you mages as my servants, I'll be able to destroy my enemies and finally take the crown that is rightfully mine."
"You're mad," Thanos replied defiantly. "We will never serve you, nor will we serve any other claimant. We are neutral in this war. The struggle for power is not our concern. The days when mages intervened in the wars of men ended centuries ago. King or no king, we will not break our oaths." The Baron clucked his tongue against his teeth for a few moments. An awkward silence descended upon the room.
"I have 3,000 men inside this city, all wearing these amulets, and another 6,000 that are not. If I give the order, then every mage and civilian in this city will be slain, and you will be powerless to stop it, unless, of course, you join me."
Luxon frowned. The man was lying. He had seen a number of his men being bested by magic. Wellesley had slain several with it himself, unless, of course, his being close to those soldiers and their amulets was what had weakened him enough to allow the assassins to strike. A knot of fear wormed into Luxon's gut. The Baron had them right where he wanted them. Calderia would fall, and there was nothing the mages could do to stop it. A memory popped into his head, something that Grand Master Thanos had said. "To me, and to everyone else, magic is something that we must spend decades in near constant practice to bring out such power in us. The magic within you is like a second skin, Luxon. It is a reflex to you, just like when you blink."
The amulets didn't work on him. That's why he was able to cast fire against the assassin that wounded Wellesley. His magic was unaffected.
Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the doors to the chamber. The crystal door swung slowly, its heavy weight causing its hinges to creak, alerting the Baron's men inside. Luxon strode into the chamber with as much confidence as he could muster. He was nervous. If he was wrong, then he had doomed himself. The Baron turned to face the young man who had brazenly walked into the chamber.
"Who in blazes is this?"
he demanded. Luxon's stomach fluttered with nerves. The masters were all watching him in disbelief, but Thanos stood still, a faint smile on his lips. Taking a deep breath, Luxon pushed his shoulders back and held his head high in an attempt to look as tall and menacing as possible.
"I am Luxon Eidos, Master of the Arcane, Weaver of Spells, Destroyer of Worlds," he boomed in what he hoped was a terrifying voice.
He felt his heart sink as the Baron and his cronies simply broke down into laughter. Thanos, though, was still smiling and nodded his head in encouragement. Acadas stepped forward. No amused smirk was on his face. Instead, his green eyes were narrow in hatred. In his armour, the bully looked even taller and more imposing than when they last met.
"Luxon the coward, more like,"
Acadas spat angrily.
"Luxon the liar, Luxon the little shit."
The shame of being banished from Calderia had been almost too much to bear. The insult to his family name deserved retribution. The Baron placed a hand on his son's chest, halting his triad of insults. His pig-like features gazed at Luxon in amusement.
"So this is the boy who bested you in a fight and got you exiled from your studies. The son of Garrick. The liar seems to have had more balls than his father, at least."
The Baron tittered humorlessly.
"It was your father that started this war, you know, boy. If he had just kept his mouth shut, then I would now be king unchallenged. His foolish talk of a surviving heir had caused more bloodshed these past 3 years than even the Yondol invasion did."
Luxon stepped back. Anger swelled within him as the fat Baron insulted his father's memory. His right hand clenched into a fist, and once more he felt the magic fill him. The sense of power was addictive. Heat flooded up his arm.
"Take care of this little fool. Whatever power he thinks he has, the amulets will dispel,"
the Baron said dismissively, turning his back to face the masters.
"Now, where were we?
Eclin and the Baron's men advanced upon Luxon. Seeing the boy was unarmed, they kept their swords sheathed.
"You deserve nothing less than to be beaten to death,"
Eclin chuckled evilly.
"I'm going to finish what I started in that street, and I'm going to enjoy it."
With a roar, he charged at Luxon. Magic like he had never felt before surged through Luxon's body. Power like nothing he'd even read about coursed through his veins. He felt stronger, faster, and to his amazement his attackers appeared to move as slow as a drunken slug. The world around him faded from his consciousness. Only the charging Retbit soldiers remained in his vision. All sound was muted. He easily sidestepped the first punch swung by Eclin and ducked the next. To him, they were in slow motion. But to anyone watching, the vicious punches were coming in fast and strong. The other soldiers joined the attack, but Luxon dodged and weaved through the men's flailing limbs. Not one hand even got close to him. "What the Baron shouted as he watched. The boy was literally dancing through the hail of blows. He should have been a bloody heap on the floor. Instead, the Baron's men were growing tired and more than a little afraid. The soldiers stepped back from the boy, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Their heavy armour had weighed upon them, draining their strength. Only Eclin remained, his fury quickly being replaced with desperation. Again and again he tried to hit Luxon, but couldn't. The Baron spun to face Thanos, pointing at his son's failing attempt to strike the young mage.
"What devilry is this? How can this be?"
he shouted, his voice rising in pitch to make him sound like a petulant child. Thanos simply shrugged his shoulders, not saying a word. Finally, Eclin slumped to his knees in exhaustion.
"What are you?"
he gasped at Luxon. "Someone you do not want to trifle with again," Luxon replied coldly. It would have been so easy to strike down his foe, but something stayed his hand. A whisper at the back of his mind gave a warning against such action. The dream of the gnarled tree flashed into his mind. The mysterious spectre was there. "He has a part yet to play," it whispered.
"Kill the little wretch! Kill him!"
screamed the Baron. His face was red, flushed with anger. He would not allow a boy to unravel his plans. The tired soldiers wearily drew their swords, once more advancing on the strange boy. Luxon faced them. The power was still surging through him. He knew that at this moment anything was possible. He had fully channeled the magic of the upper ring, something that even the most powerful of masters had difficulty doing. "What am I?" He raised his hand. With a flick of his wrist, he unleashed a telekinetic blast that flung the soldiers backwards into a startled pile. Their swords flew from their hands to hover around Luxon. Each of the blades then turned their aim at the panicked Baron. The soldiers staggered to their feet, looked at their lord and then at the boy, whose sandy hair was standing up and whose eyes had turned into an unearthly bright blue. With shouts of terror they fled the chamber. Luxon let them. Eclin stared at his foe. Both terror and awe etched onto his expression. "Leave!" Luxon boomed at Eclin, his voice too resonant with power. Its volume shook the chamber, causing dust to fall from the high ceiling. He didn't have to ask twice. Eclin scrambled to his feet, and he fled, leaving the Baron alone with the masters and the boy with the powers that rivaled the tales of Zarnia. The Baron was quaking visibly, his lip trembling as though he were about to cry. Luxon glared at the Baron, his magic-infused eyes boring into him. "You will leave this city, never to return," Luxon demanded. "You will flee back to your castle and never threaten the mages, ever again." Feebly, the Baron took the amulet from his neck and thrust it at Luxon. "Your magic will not work on me. I have this," he said, trying to sound defiant. Luxon glared at the talisman of Engist. He could sense the dark magic flowing from it. Angrily, he batted it out of the Baron's hands, sending it skidding across the crystal floor. Master Ryjas quickly gathered it up into his robes. The Baron shrank under Luxon's gaze. Thanos and the others crowded around him. "Heed the words of Luxon, Baron, or be destroyed." Thanos whispered threateningly into the man's ear. "Magic is not to be used by the likes of you for selfish gain. Order your troops to leave this city, and we will spare your foul life." The Baron nodded. "We will leave. Forgive me. Please don't kill me," the mighty and powerful Baron of Redbit cried feebly. "Be gone and never return," Thanos shouted. The Baron fled from the chamber. The Grand Master turned to Luxon. The unnatural blue from the boy's eyes had faded, and his skin had turned pale. Thanos smiled, Catching the boy as he collapsed from exhaustion. "Thank you," he whispered. Chapter 13. The sound of knocking drifted into Luxon's consciousness. The big bed was just as comfortable as before, albeit there were more blankets covering him than last time. Slowly, he opened his eyes. Once again, the portrait of Zarnia greeted him as he awoke. "Really need to stop meeting like this," he muttered to the picture. His limbs felt heavy, and he felt drained. The room hadn't changed, aside from there now being a huge basket of fruit laid on the bedside table, and several dozen bunches of flowers laid haphazardly about the floor. A few were in vases. "Really must find some more vases for all of these flowers. It's sad to see them all die," Hannah grumbled as she strode into the room, another bunch in her arms. She stopped as she noticed that Luxon was awake. Her large blue eyes widened, and she gave a joyous smile. "Finally, you're awake," she said, sitting on the bed and taking his hands in hers. She frowned slightly at his touch. "You're still very cold," she muttered. Luxon arched an eyebrow. "How long was I out this time?" he asked. His stomach rumbled. He was famished. "And can I have something to eat? I feel like I could eat a whole herd of cattle." Hannah smiled again. She placed the back of her palm on his forehead. "Yes, you can eat. I'll send your friend to go and get you something. As for how long you were unconscious, well, let's just say it was a few days." She smiled sweetly. Her eyes, however, looked away. She wasn't telling him something. "How long was I out?" he asked again, a hint of worry in his voice. Hannah sighed and stood. "You were out cold for 3 weeks, Luxon," she explained, concern evident in her tone. I was terrified that you'd never wake up." Luxon slumped back into his thick pillows. 3 weeks, he whispered in disbelief. His mind whirled at the revelation. What had happened to him? He remembered feeling powerful, godlike powerful, standing up to Arcadus and the Baron, and then nothing. "Don't worry," Hannah said. "The city is safe. The Nightblades and the Masters chased off the Baron's men, and for the assassins, they simply disappeared once the Baron retreated. We lost good people, but most are safe and well." "What about Wellesley? Elira, Yeppert, what happened to them?" "Wellesley is fine. In fact, he's in a room just down the corridor from here. Your friend Yeppert has been at your bedside every day and has been tending to your needs." She paused, a scowl denting her beautiful features. "As for Elira, she's still hanging about." Luxon smiled at her tone. "Jealous, are we?" Hannah glared at him. "No, just because she's pretty does not mean I'm jealous. There's just something about her I don't like. I mean, she's been a real help dealing with the injured and getting supplies from the markets, but—" She paused and laughed. "I do sound jealous, don't I?" Luxon chuckled. "Yep, you sure do." A gentle knocking on the door interrupted their conversation. "Grand Master," Hannah said, bowing to Thanos. The tall man wore a simple tunic of blue and a pair of dirty black trousers. His boots, too, were covered in dust. His face was smeared with black soot, and tired rings were under his blue eyes. He returned Hannah's bow and smiled pleasantly as she scurried out of the room. Luxon was sad to see her go. It was the first time he'd been able to be alone with her in weeks. "I see you're finally awake, O saviour of Calderia," Thanos said, chuckling as he gave an exaggerated bow. "The what?" "That is what everyone is hailing you as, my boy. The people of this city know that it was you who saved them from the Baron. Just look at all the gifts you received." Thanos looked around at the flowers and the other gifts that were scattered about the room. "Master, why are you covered in dirt?" Luxon asked. Normally the Grand Master wore his robes of office, or the garb one would expect of the Archmage. The tall man waved a hand dismissively. "I've been helping with the clean-up. The Baron's men left us quite a mess in the Alchemist district," Thanos explained as he read a card from one of Luxon's many well-wishers. "I swear the fumes released by some of the alchemist potions contained contraband goods. The fires set by the soldiers sent a great big plume of smoke over the city, and now half the populace are high as kites." Luxon couldn't help but smile. From his glassy gaze, the Grand Master too must have inhaled a fair share of fumes. "Now," Thanos said, turning to face his apprentice, "I wish to discuss your health, my lad. How do you feel?" "I feel exhausted, truth be told. And cold," Luxon replied, shivering. The Grand Master stood over the bed and pressed a hand to the boy's head. He muttered something under his breath, and as he did, so Luxon felt a surge of warmth pour into his body. Ah, that's better. Let's get some colour back into those cheeks, eh? Thanos smiled kindly. The reason you blacked out is because you tapped into the highest ring of magic. I didn't realize that your special talent would allow you to do so, especially since you have had very little training. He paused, tapping his chin with his fingers. Some might say you could be a No, that's silly. There hasn't been one in Delfinnia for a good 200 years. Luxon shifted in his bed uncomfortably. Whatever Thanos had done had made him too hot. What hasn't been around for 200 years? He asked, throwing back the heavy blankets to allow some air to reach his body. He was wearing his nightshirt, which he assumed Yeppert had brought to him from the dorm room. Sweat was starting to pour from his forehead. A wizard, of course. The most powerful of magic wielders. I am strong in the weight of magic, but even a wizard would best me. Thanos stared at his young apprentice, his eyes boring into him. Luxon shifted again. Something was definitely not right. Master, I'm boiling up, Luxon said, a hint of panic in his voice. Hannah re-entered the room, concern etched on her face. Her eyes went wide as she saw her patient's condition. Sweat was literally running off the boy. Oh my, what's happened here? She said as she rushed over to him. She glanced at Thanos and scowled. Did you do something, Master Thanos? You shouldn't be doing any magic in your state, she scolded. You breathed in far too much of those fumes from the alchemist district. Thanos simply shrugged his shoulders. His eyes glazed. He was high. He said he was cold. Thanos slurred, the Grand Master staggering slightly as Hannah gently pushed him out of the way. She leant over Luxon and pulled a bottle of brown liquid from the pouch tied to her belt. Here, drink this. Nurse, she called out into the hall. A squat woman with greying hair hurried into the room. Take the Grand Master back to his bed and make sure he doesn't leave. I swear, intoxicated mages are the worst. The nurse took hold of Thanos' hand and guided him out of the room like a drunkard. He staggered more than once. Luxon would have laughed at the sight, but the heat was becoming unbearable. Hannah opened the bottle, tilted his head back and poured the sticky fluid down his throat. It tasted foul, but almost immediately the heat began to fade. Ah, what was that? Luxon spluttered. A dispelling potion. The Grand Master must have cast a spell, one that he couldn't control in his condition. Luxon sighed in relief as the heat dissipated. How long will I have to stay in bed? He asked, sitting up, stretching his tired limbs. The tiredness was weighing him down like an anchor, but he had to get out into the world. He'd seen enough of the Medica to last a lifetime, and he was starving. I'll probably let you leave this afternoon if you feel well enough. I'll get Yeppert to give you some food and take you back to the dorms. I have a feeling that once the Master recovers from his condition, he'll be a busy man. Luxon's cheeks flushed red. She had called him a man. Without realizing it, he puffed his chest out. Chapter 14. Luxon was happy. He'd eaten his weight in food, slept for an entire day, and was now sat out in the sunshine. He'd also been able to spend some quality time with Hannah. Their walks through the woods and city had only made him fonder of her. The small balcony looked out over the main thoroughfare of the Quartz district and was an excellent sun trap. The warmth was relaxing and allowed his mind to drift. Yeppert sat in a chair next to him, his feet resting on the balcony's stone rail and his eyes covered by the book he was reading. Life was pretty good. The bustle on the streets far below continued as usual, as traders and craftsmen rushed to and fro. Parts of the city had been damaged by the Baron's raid, the Rainbow Quarter receiving most of the damage. Fire had ravaged a large portion of the Alchemist district, and the smoke was still seen drifting lazily in the midsummer sunshine. "This is the life," Yeppert exclaimed happily. Gravy from the earlier meal of mutton and potatoes was covering his face. "You know what, Lux? I reckon things are going to be fine. That knight I found in the alley outside the Arc Tower is doing well, I hear. That makes me happy." Luxon smiled at his friend's optimism. The wider world was in chaos, but on the balcony, peace reigned supreme. "I hope you're right, but from what I overheard in the dining hall, the war is escalating in the south," Luxon replied, after taking a sip from his cup of tea. One of those refugees from the Kingsford said that the Baron of Balnor had regrouped and was launching an offensive against the Baron of Champia, who, in turn, is fighting the Baron of Blackmoor. It's a right mess, and the news from the mountains of Eclin is just, well, weird. Yeppert waved his hand dismissively. "These things always used to happen in the olden days. They always get fixed in the end, and I'm quite happy to stay here, learn my lessons and eat like a king." Luxon chuckled. What did you mean, the news from Eclin is weird? Yeppert asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Plock isn't far south from its borders. I overheard a trader who had come from that region that a great battle had taken place in the mountains at Fuayo Pass, and the Baron of Eclin was in retreat. He wasn't sure whether the battle had been against some of the mountain folk or something worse. As Luxon spoke, the sense of unease returned, and again he felt the cold breeze coming from the north. I don't like the sound of that, Yeppert fretted. Surely my ma and pa would have sent word if they were in danger. Luxon shuddered slightly. The voice of the spectre drifted into his consciousness. More in Eclin than you know. What time is it? Yeppert asked, suddenly sitting up with a wide yawn and snapping Luxon's attention back to reality. He shook his head as the spectre's rasping tones faded. I think it's close to 3. Why? Yeppert leapt to his feet, panic on his chubby face. Oh, heck! I was supposed to take you to the council members then. Master Thanos has called for a moot of all the mages in the city. He ran inside to gather their mages' robes and shoes. Come on, no lying about. I promised I'd get you there on time. I reckon you're going to get a big reward for what you did, he added excitedly. The chamber was enormous. Its ceilings arched impossibly high until Luxon could no longer see the ceiling. Huge stained glass windows were hollowed out into the blue crystal that made up the biggest structure in Calderia, the Palace of Zarnia. The structure was only used for formal ceremonies and mass gatherings of the mages. The rest of the time, it was used by the city's crafters as a trading centre. There were no stalls or merchants in there when Luxon and Yeppert filed through the big stone doors. Instead, the chamber was full of robed mages. Every magic user in the city was there, from lowly students to the Grand Master who stood on the dais at the heart of the room. The 2 boys pushed their way to the front. Upon recognizing him, the crowd parted and began to clap. Luxon flushed red in embarrassment. Yeppert clapped him on the back and smiled proudly. Calls of well done and thanks came from the mages. Both young and old smiled and applauded. Upon seeing Luxon in the crowd, Thanos held up his arms for quiet. My fellow mages, your applause for Luxon Eidos is indeed warranted, his voice echoed through the chamber. But I must insist we save our celebrations for another time. Yeppert's smile dropped. Luxon stopped. Something in the Grand Master's voice halted the claps. The mages sensed that something was wrong. The crowd turned their attention to Thanos, the boy forgotten. Murmurs and rumours spread through the crowd. Thanos held his right hand in the air. Dangling from it was the Engist amulet the Baron had worn. I have here in my hand a relic from the Age of Darkness. Agitated murmurs spread through the crowd. It is now clear that the events that have ravaged Delfinnia have been orchestrated by an enemy we have long thought defeated. An enemy whose sole purpose is to restore darkness to the world. This is an amulet of the cult of Engist, necromancers and the disciples of the dread Lord, Danon. Shouts of protest came from the crowd. Impossible! Yelled an elderly mage whose green robes were frayed from decades of use and whose grey hair was long and wild. They were all destroyed in the magic wars. None survive. Other mages took up the man's call. Thanos held a hand up to quell the crowd. The feelings of anger and fear were palpable. It was with these that the Baron of Retbit and his forces infiltrated our city and bested our Nightblades. They were immune to our powers. Tell me, Yinga, the Grand Master said, glaring at the old mage. How else do you account for what happened? The question now is, what are we going to do about it? Silence once more settled over the crowd. Yinga, the old mage, looked at his feet, uncomfortable, as the truth sunk in. What can we do? Master Duvok called from the front rank of the crowd. By the laws of the realm, we mages are confined to using our power only in Calderia. Even as the war rages, we are bound by the law not to interfere. Only a king could give us the authority needed to do so, and with no king, our hands are tied. If we do intervene without a mandate, then the realm will unite against us and destroy us. They do not trust us. Whilst the barons slaughter each other for power, and we are bound here by law, then the true enemy is on the march. Delfinnia is a land divided, and it is the perfect time for them to strike. Damn the law, came a deep voice. The crowd fell silent. Thanos' eyes widened as he recognized who had spoken. The crowd parted as a tall man with shoulder-length black hair strode towards the dais. He wore the black garb of a nightblade. A silver chain hung from his neck, and a bow and quiver hung across his back. His face was fierce. There was a scar on his cheek, as though a claw from some beast had raked it. The man leapt up onto the dais to stand next to Thanos.
"You know me. I am Ferren of the Black Moor,"
the Nightblade said. Another bout of whispering and murmurs spread through the crowd. Luxon racked his brain. He had no idea who the man was. Yeppert leaned closer, sensing his friend's confusion. "That's the rogue blade. The Nightblade that refused to return to Calderia when the war started," Yeppert whispered conspiratorially. "He refused the summons and continued his work, hunting the beasts of the void. Some say he's a hero, others say he's a traitor."
"I have continued my mission to defend the realm from the fell beasts of the void, whilst my brother Nightblades scurried back here to hide,"
Ferren said. A roar of protest came from the crowd. Luxon noticed that the Nightblades amongst them lowered their heads as though they were ashamed.
"I have seen the true face of the war that you choose to hide from. Innocents perish at the hands of monsters and men, whilst you, who have the power to defend them, hide away because of your fear of some law made centuries ago. The king is dead, and not one of those barons deserves to replace him,"
Ferren enthused, drowning out the calls of protest. The Nightblade paced the dais, his anger visible in his energetic strides.
"We could appeal to the Diasect for the repeal of the law,"
a voice in the crowd said. Some of the mages nodded in agreement. Most tried to shout down the suggestion. Ferren scoffed.
"The Diasect? Where have they been the past few years? No one has heard from them in a decade. The self-proclaimed guardians of the realm have been silent. No help will come from them."
Thanos placed a hand on the Nightblade's shoulder. "I understand your frustration, Ferren. Come, let us discuss this matter privately," the Archmage said, softly but sternly. He faced the crowd.
"This meeting is dismissed. A decision will be decided upon. Just know that you must be ever vigilant. If the Engis cult has survived, then we must all be on our guard."
The crowd began to disperse, and the noise rose as the mages chatted amongst themselves. Arguments broke out over who was right. Should the mages break the old laws and intervene with the war? Most were opposed. The last time mages had interfered in political affairs or matters of war, they had abused their power to take control and had caused the worst conflict in the land's history. Luxon and Yeppert were just about to leave when Thanos called out,
"Luxon, come with me."
Yeppert raised his eyebrows in surprise. Luxon's stomach fluttered with nerves. "Now what?" he grumbled. Yeppert simply shrugged his shoulders and clapped him on the back, before joining the other mages filtering out of the great chamber. Luxon took a deep breath and walked towards the dais. As he approached, he noticed that a few other people had remained behind. The girl, Elira, stood nervously next to the Knight of Noveran. Caden wore the mantle of his order, his hair and beard impeccably trimmed. Only the cane he was holding gave any clue to the injuries he had suffered on the night of the Baron's attack. Next to them was Ferren, who was having an animated discussion with Wellesley. The Nightblade was bent over slightly, due to the bandages wrapped around his knife wound. As Luxon drew near, the others stopped their conversations.
"Really, Thanos? You honestly think the boy is ready?"
Ferren said, doubt and scorn evident in his tone as he appraised the boy. Thanos smiled kindly, offering a hand to his apprentice, and pulled him up onto the raised dais. "I do. He has proven himself capable, and I know that he has a part to play in coming events." Luxon hesitated. "Ready for what, Master?" he asked nervously. The Nightblade, Ferren, strode over to the boy, grabbing him by the scruff of the neck. He pulled him closer so they were eye to eye. Luxon cried out in protest. Caden reached for his sword, but stopping as Thanos waved a hand in warning. "To go out into the big wide world," the Grand Master said. "To go see the Diasect firsthand, and to face danger from both mortal and undead foes alike." Luxon stared into Ferren's brown eyes. The man had seen so much. It was evident in the dark rings and the haunted look. Here was a man who had seen death, someone who knew loss, and definitely a man who knew hate. Luxon wanted to look away but didn't. Instead, he held the Nightblade's gaze. Ferren smiled wickedly and released his grip. "You have guts, kid, Perhaps you are ready."
"Not many men could hold my gaze for long, let alone a boy," Ferren chuckled, offering his hand to the boy. Luxon sighed in relief before shaking it. The Nightblade had a powerful grip. Respect had replaced the mocking look in his eyes. Thanos coughed impatiently. The group gathered about him. "I have a plan," he said conspiratorially. "As you all saw, the mages are against breaking the old law. They fear that the temptation to use their power for personal gain will be too strong, that once more our kind will bring the world to ruin. I understand that fear. What I cannot do, however, is stand idly by as our enemies gather strength. You 5 will leave the city and seek out the dire sect. From what Sir Caden tells me, his order has a similar goal in mind, albeit for a different purpose than we seek." The knight stepped forward, placing a cloth map onto the dire's floor. The realm of Delfinnia was laid out before them. "The Order dispatched me and Lyra here to find out about Luxon," he explained. "The rest of the Order, meanwhile, mobilized. A squadron of knights was dispatched to the Diasec's stronghold at Tentive." He traced a route from the Neveran Priory to East Tentive. The stronghold was located deep in the heart of a forest, known as the Fallen Woods. "The masters of my order, like you, Master Thanos, want to know why there has been no word from them. As guardians of the kingdom, they should have intervened a long time ago. Instead, only silence has emerged from Tentive." Luxon thought for a moment. He had read about the Diasect in a number of history tomes from the library. It was a council charged with overseeing the affairs of the realm. Several times in the past, they had resolved disputes and offered guidance to kings. Mystery revolved about them, though, and the common folk had little trust for them. Some books said that the Diasect was made up of the souls of dead kings. Others that they were a council of solitude-loving wizards, or even creatures of the void. So rarely were they seen that many believed them just to be a myth. "I thought that it was forbidden for anyone to seek them out. That Tentive is forbidden for all but those chosen by the Diasect to be their servants," Lyra said softly. Luxon frowned at the girl. Her face wore an expression of worry, but there was something else there behind the nervous exterior. "It is forbidden, my lady, but we must find out why they have not intervened, and we must also find out more about your visions," Thanos said kindly. Ferren clapped his hands together loudly. "Right then. I want us all to be on the road by the end of the week. The healers said that your leg should be better by then, Knight. As for you, Wellesley, are you even able to come? We can't have someone with us who can't even move." Wellesley tried to stand straighter, but winced as his wound pinched. "I'm afraid Ferren is right, Grandmaster," Wellesley said miserably. "I'm in no position to travel, let alone fight if needs be." "Very well," the Grandmaster said distantly, his eyes unfocused as though he was seeing something far off. "Yeppert, Luxon's friend, will accompany you," Thanos said, raising a hand to cut off Ferren's protest. A twinkle was in the Grandmaster's eyes. Luxon scowled slightly. What was Thanos up to? Both he and Yeppert had no training in the martial arts, and neither of them could cast the magic needed to fight, at least not consciously. Ferren fumed but kept his mouth shut. Too many times in the past he'd gone against the decisions of mages, and every time he had paid the price. "Fine. The boy can come, but I cannot promise his safety. If we are to reach Tentive alive, then we are going to need more than just 2 men able to fight and 3 children with no training." He held up a hand to quell Lyra and Luxon's protest. "There is another in this city that I want with us. I just hope she'll forgive me enough to listen to what I have to say." Chapter 15. It had been a good 6 years since Ferren had willingly chosen to walk the streets of the Stone Quarter. This part of the city was renowned for being the home of Calderia's less than respectable citizens. It was a well-known fact that the Guild of Thieves, known as the Fleetfoots, had a presence in the warren of ramshackle stone houses. The sound of a barroom brawl came from an alleyway to his left. He pulled his black hood tighter about his face and took a deep breath. He hated this part of the city. It was here that he had spent much of his misspent youth. He smiled at the memories of being a snot-nosed, cocky kid who wasn't afraid of anything or anyone. The smile abruptly faded as other, darker memories resurfaced. He picked up the pace and made his way across the rickety wooden bridge that led across the pungent stream running through the quarter. Being just down from the alchemist district meant that the fast-flowing water was often contaminated with all sorts of dangerous poisons and had strange magical properties. Many were the number of children that played in the fetid waters, only to fall ill,
or worse, die. The mages from the Medica did their best to help, but resentment towards the spellcasters who lived in their crystal towers was high. It was ironic that even in the one city where the mages were allowed to practice their spells and magic, they were disliked. Farron shrugged his shoulders. Master Durak had been right. If the mages defied the old law, then most of the common folk would turn on them out of fear and old resentments. Even he, a Nightblade, had to be careful outside Calderia's walls. In the small villages and towns in the countryside, he was often met with distrust. Even when saving them from the beasts of the void, they would be reluctant to offer him any thanks. He knew the stone quarter like the back of his hand. It only took him a few minutes to find his destination. Nestled into the stone wall was a worn wooden door. Above it hung a wreath adorned with mystical objects and runes. Etched into the stone on the right-hand side was a sigil, warding against evil. He took a deep breath, his stomach fluttering with nerves. Would she forgive him? Would she even hear what he had to say? Cautiously he approached the door and knocked on the wooden surface. The door creaked open a notch to reveal a small lad. The boy was no older than 8, and his dirty face and long, shaggy black hair gave him away to be one of the street urchins that lived in the quarter. The Fleetfoot thieves often used the many orphans and homeless children as lookouts, or in some cases, as distractions. "Is she in?" Farron asked. The boy's green eyes went wide.
"I don't know who you're talking about, mister,"
the lad answered nervously. The boy was about to slam the door shut when Farron jammed it with his foot and forced it open. The boy fell onto his backside and scrambled to his feet. Farron moved quickly and grabbed the urchin by the arm. He spun the boy around and glared hard into his face. "Is she in?" Farron asked again. This time the boy nodded, in the affirmative. Farron released the lad and with his boot kicked him out into the street before shutting the door. He found himself inside a place that brought with it bad memories. A small candle was the only source of illumination in the living area. A broken chair stuffed with straw sat in the corner, and a simple bookshelf lined the wall. To the side was a tiny kitchen area, complete with several baskets of dried fruit and bread. Directly in front of him was a narrow stone staircase, which led up into the tiny home's bedrooms. Absent-mindedly, he ran a gloved finger over the back of the chair. "It was here that I did it," he thought as memories came flooding back. He was jolted back to reality by the feel of a sharp blade pressed against the back of his neck. "You have a lot of nerve coming here," snarled a familiar female voice. Farron raised his hands to show he was unarmed. "I had hoped you would have forgiven me by now, Sophia. I did what was necessary," Farron said sadly. Slowly he turned to see the woman who wielded the knife. She was stood on the stairs, with the dagger aimed at his head. He almost caught his breath. She looked the same as she had done the last time he had seen her all those years ago. They had been lovers once, but any look of kindness for him was absent from her eyes. Instead, all he saw was hate. Her long black hair was tied into a top knot and her large brown eyes were as fierce as he remembered. Sophia Cunning, the witch hunter who had won his heart, was as beautiful as ever. "Forgive you? You murdered my father, you bastard, and then left me on the roadside to hold him in my arms as he died. I should kill you," Sophia yelled. For a moment, Farron thought that she would follow through with her threat and plunge the blade deep into his heart. Keeping his hands up, he walked forward so that the tip of the blade pressed to his chest. At this range, his leather armor would do little to slow the weapon. "Then do it, if it will make you feel better. I did what was necessary. If you search your heart, you will know it to be true," he said. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then she lowered the blade. Some of the fire left her eyes to be replaced with sadness. He had wanted to see her so many times since that night, but knew that it would have only brought them both pain. Damn her father. Damn the witch hunter general and his foul deeds. What is done is done. I did what I did to save the realm and to save her. One day she must realize that, Farron thought angrily. "What do you want from me, Farron?" Sophia said dully. She sheathed the dagger into her belt and sat heavily on the broken and worn chair. "I need your help. Grandmaster Thanos has tasked me and a small group to seek out the Dire sect, to find out why they have not intervened in the war, and to find answers about this." He paused, pulling the Engist amulet from his tunic pocket. He immediately sensed its power trying to feed off his own. Sophia's eyes went wide. She leapt out of the chair, knocking over some books from the shelf. She staggered backwards and leaned against the wall. "Where did you get that? It's impossible. Get it out of here!" she yelled. Fear was evident in her face. Ferren quickly wrapped the amulet back in the enchanted piece of cloth in which he used to transport it, and tucked it back into his tunic pocket. The cloth had masked the amulet's power, preventing it from feeding off the magic users around it. "The Baron of Redbit used a number of these to infiltrate the city during his raid. We intend to find out who provided him with them, and what the dire sect knows about them. Please, Sophia, you know about the Angus cult better than anyone," Ferren begged. He had known it was a long shot just to ask her. Showing her the amulet was bound to get her interested. She and the Order of the Witch Hunters had spent decades rooting out those who followed the dark ways, and nothing was darker than the Engist. Sophia glared at him. A mixture of emotions flooded through her. Finally, her expression firmed. "What do you have in mind?" she sighed. Chapter 16. Luxon had triple-checked his pack and had spent the previous days practicing constantly with Master Rigis. Caden had also taught him the basics of swordplay, something that he seriously doubted he'd ever get good at. Yapert, too, had been put through his paces by the old mage. Each of them had been taught most of the spells of the lower ring in a crash course of lessons that pushed them both to their limits, both mentally and physically. Elira had joined them for one of the days. Her power was strong, as was evident when she set the training room's curtains ablaze instead of the candle which she had been aiming for. Ferren, meanwhile, had been busy gathering supplies and horses for the journey. With the gold delphins given to him by Thanos, he had acquired 2 Destrier horses for himself and the witch hunter Sophia. Caden would ride his own horse, Herald. For the 2 mages and Elira, he had bought 3 Shire ponies. These sturdy animals came from the Caldarian countryside and were used to rough ground after living and working in the region's rocky foothills. The group met at the city's main gate at dawn. The horses were already loaded with supplies of food and weapons. To Luxon's surprise, Sophia's horse was covered in a sturdy harness which was filled with items. "We witch hunters always go everywhere well prepared," she said with a wink. She wore a purple cloak over a suit of tight-fitting black leather armour. The material pronounced every curve of her supple body. For a teenage boy like Luxon, it was a pleasant sight. Hung across her back was a longbow, and on her hip a quiver of deadly-looking barbed arrows. Yapert was already mounted on his pony. They all wore cloaks, but the mages wore no weapons save for small daggers which Thanos had given to them the previous night. The younger boy smiled with excitement. "I can't wait to get going, Lux. This is so exciting," he giggled. Luxon couldn't help but smile at his friend's enthusiasm. It was something that he did not share. The sense of dread had only grown stronger. Elira wore a blue cloak over her travel tunic and trousers. On her feet, she wore leather boots that rose high on her long, slender legs. Her blonde hair was tied up in a topknot. She flashed Luxon a nervous smile before climbing into the saddle. The knight, Caden, also wore a cloak over his mantle and chainmail armour. At his hip, in its sheath, was his trusty longsword. He was whispering soothing words into Herald's ears, which pricked higher up at his master's words. "Luxon!" came a shout. He turned to see Hannah running up the wide avenue. She skirted her way past a group of traders, ducking under a rug which 2 men were hauling across the street. She stopped in front of Luxon. "I didn't want you to go without us saying goodbye," she said breathlessly. She gave him a big hug. He savoured the smell of her perfumed hair and squeezed her back tightly in response. He didn't want to leave her. Now that he was leaving, he realised just how much he didn't want to leave her behind. "You come back safe," she whispered into his ear. He stepped back, keeping her at arm's length, and smiled. "I promise you, it would take an ending of the world to stop me coming back here. And to you," he added nervously. He could feel himself turning red. "I have all this power, yet I get shy around girls," he chided himself. She returned his smile and kissed him on the cheek. "I'll hold you to that." She glanced at a nearby clock tower. I have to go, or else I'll be late for my shift at the Medica. I'll miss you. Write to me if you can." She broke free from the embrace and ran off down the street towards the Quartz Quarter and the Medica. Luxon watched her go, his chest feeling heavy as he went. Yapert clapped his friend on the shoulder. "You'll see her again, Lux, I promise," the chubby boy said reassuringly. "We have a Knight of Navarran, a witch hunter, a Nightblade, and two of the best mages in Calderia. What could go wrong?
Ferren hauled himself into his saddle. Mount up! We've got a lot of ground to cover.
He waved to one of the gate guards who pulled the heavy lever that opened the city gates. With a loud sound of grinding metal, the heavy doors swung open to reveal the wider world beyond. The sun was high and bright in the sky, and the sound of songbirds filled the air. At least it doesn't look like rain, Luxon muttered as he mounted his pony and spurred it into a trot. The small band was finally on their way. The long King's Road and its perils awaited them.